Robert Bob Sanders had never been a man of loud words or loud company. After a career in the Army and a life spent moving from place to place, he'd long learned to value what most others barely noticed: silence, routine, and the small rituals that made a house into a home. When his wife Evelyn died 10 years ago, it wasn't grief that unmoored him. It was the sudden emptiness of those shared rituals, the sound of her humming while planting herbs, the way she always left the porch light on for him even when he came home early. After she passed, Bob didn't retreat from the world, but he certainly didn't chase after it either. He settled into their custom-built home on the edge of a slow-breathing neighborhood where the houses were painted beige and the sidewalks had no cracks. The house wasn't big by most standards, but it was honest. Brick and cedar with hand-trimmed eaves and a small, slightly wild garden out front, just the way Evelyn liked it. There was a particular section of the yard, beneath the south-facing bedroom window, where Evelyn had planted native wildflowers that would only bloom for 3 weeks every spring. Since her death, Bob had refused to cut that patch. Every year, he watched it come alive, not out of superstition, but out of loyalty to the woman who had spent 32 years loving him in all the ways that mattered most. Now, at 62, confined to a wheelchair after a spinal injury during a roofing accident, not war, not something cinematic, just life, Bob managed well enough. He'd retrofitted the house himself with ramps and railings, kept his hands busy with minor woodworking projects in the garage, and rarely asked for help. The community around him changed slowly, like layers of paint fading in the sun. Younger families moved in, older ones passed away, and the Neighborhood Beautification Committee, as they liked to call themselves, had taken on more power than Bob ever remembered voting for. They weren't a formal HOA, not legally binding, not on paper, but they collected dues, enforced standards, and wielded clipboards like swords. Most residents didn't mind. Some even liked the illusion of order, the petty tyranny of mulch uniformity and mailbox placement. Bob stayed out of it. He had better things to care about, like whether his tomatoes would hold through the heat wave, or if the new young neighbor's dog would ever stop tearing up the sidewalk with its nails. But then came Karen. Karen Whitmore had moved in across the street 6 months ago and had already been unanimously appointed as chairwoman of the neighborhood committee. Bob didn't need a file on her to know the type. She was round-faced, broad-shouldered, always in pastel slacks that looked like they'd been ironed even while she slept. She carried a clipboard almost religiously, her name embossed in gold on the top. Her voice had the shrill, practiced timbre of someone who believed every word she said came straight from a place of righteousness. She'd introduced herself to Bob on her first day with a fruit basket that looked more like a bribe and a laminated pamphlet that outlined the expectations of the neighborhood. He hadn't even read it. He'd nodded politely, thanked her for the fruit, and wheeled himself back inside without a second thought. At first, she kept her distance. There were other neighbors to audit, other grass heights to measure, other flags hung at improper angles to scold. But Bob's yard, or rather that patch of wildflowers, eventually caught her attention. It was early April when she rang his doorbell. Not knocked, rang, insistently, like she'd already made up her mind about who he was. Bob rolled to the front, opened the door with a smooth click of the side latch, and found her standing on the porch with a digital measuring tool in one hand and her clipboard in the other. Without saying hello, she gestured toward the yard. "You know," she said, pursing her lips in a way that suggested she thought herself polite when, in fact, she was itching for a confrontation. "Grass above 6 inches is a code violation under the Aesthetic Maintenance Agreement." Bob blinked at her, then looked at the flowers behind her, purple coneflowers, golden tickseed, and black-eyed Susans, just starting to break through the soil. He kept his tone even. "That's not grass," he said calmly. "It's a native pollinator patch. My late wife planted it. It's deliberate." Karen tapped her clipboard as though that somehow confirmed she was right. Wild or not, it's an eyesore. People are starting to complain. There's a reason we have guidelines, Mr. Sanders. A community needs standards. Bob smiled thinly. "I'm not part of your committee." She sniffed. "This isn't about participation. It's about respecting the people around you. If you can't keep things tidy, we'll have to explore alternative actions." He closed the door on her mid-sentence. The threat lingered like smoke. It wasn't new. There had always been people who thought conformity equaled morality. But this time, there was a spark behind it. Over the following days, small changes began to appear. A passive-aggressive letter appeared in his mailbox with no return address, citing unpleasant visuals. Someone, he never saw who, took it upon themselves to stack 5 fresh bales of store-bought sod right on the edge of his yard, as though suggesting he ought to use it. Bob moved them to the compost pile without a word. A week later, a note was taped to his garage door. "Cut your lawn or expect action." Still unsigned, still cowardly. And still, Bob did nothing rash. He did what men like him had always done. He documented. Quietly, thoroughly, with time-stamped photos and certified mail records. He wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt was colder, more methodical. He knew enough to let people hang themselves with their own rope. He knew patience outlived ego. But what he hadn't anticipated, what no rational man could, was how far someone like Karen could spiral when left unchecked. She wasn't content to simply harass, to shame, to impose rules on paper. She wanted submission. She wanted to look out her window and see her version of beauty reflected back. And Bob, with his wheelchair, his quiet house, and his stubborn patch of unruly flowers, was a blemish in her perfect design. She began circling the block more often, lingering outside his fence, whispering to other neighbors, her arms folded like a preacher watching over sinners. Bob heard from one neighbor, a man he barely knew, that Karen had referred to him as that squatter vet with the jungle yard. Bob didn't respond. He wasn't looking for a fight, but fights have a way of finding you when someone else is desperate enough to start one. It all might have faded into the slow churn of neighborhood tension, just another chapter in the war of fences and hedges, except for the day she came onto his property. No permission, no warning, no decency. Just Karen, standing there in his yard with a phone in one hand, a spray bottle in the other, and her voice raised just high enough to sound like authority. That was the moment things stopped being frustrating. That was the moment they became dangerous. The morning after Karen trespassed onto Bob's property, the air felt denser, heavier somehow, as if the wind itself carried tension. Bob hadn't confronted her when he spotted her by the wildflowers. He hadn't needed to. The cameras had caught everything, and he simply wheeled himself back inside, logged the footage, and sent a copy to his lawyer. He didn't believe in dramatic retaliation, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man to run out on the porch and start yelling. That was what people like Karen expected, an overreaction they could use against you. But the line had been crossed. He wasn't sure how far she was willing to take this, but something about the way she'd sprayed that bottle, her hand trembling slightly while she muttered to herself about neighborhood expectations, made it clear this wasn't just about aesthetics. This was personal, and personal vendettas never stayed small. By noon that same day, a plain white envelope arrived in his mailbox. No return address, no postage stamp, clearly hand-delivered. Inside was a letter typed in Comic Sans, as if to mock the seriousness of its tone. It read, "You have been warned. Further non-compliance will be escalated. Last chance." Bob stared at the paper for a long time, not out of fear, but calculation. It was the kind of amateur threat that people make when they're emboldened by silence, when they think rules bend to the volume of their voice. He filed the letter with the others in a folder labeled with duct tape. Noise. That night, just after midnight, his motion sensor lights flickered on at the edge of the property. The camera footage showed a dark SUV pulling up slowly, idling for several minutes before backing away. The plates were obscured. He made another copy of the video, Stored it, didn't report it, yet. 2 days later, while inspecting the perimeter of his garden, Bob noticed something strange. The small irrigation valve near the flower bed had been twisted nearly shut, as if someone had deliberately tried to dehydrate that part of the yard. The handle had faint scratch marks, not from tools, but from fingernails, desperate and aggressive. He turned it back, checked the pressure, and silently noted how petty someone had to be to sneak into a veteran's yard at night to choke the water flow of a garden. It escalated further on the following Saturday. Bob was having coffee in the kitchen, watching the sun rise over the backyard, when he saw a landscaping crew pull up. A nondescript white van with a bright green logo reading, Eco Trim Solutions. 3 men got out, walked to his gate, and began unloading tools. Bob rolled out to meet them at the fence, calm but curious. The lead worker, a young man with a trimmed beard and mirrored sunglasses, looked mildly annoyed by Bob's presence. "We're here for the removal," he said flatly, glancing at a clipboard. "Removal of what?" Bob asked, already knowing the answer. "Excess vegetation," the man replied. "We got a work order from the local committee. Said this property's been approved for corrective service." Bob didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply asked to see the order. The man handed over a sheet of paper with no header, no official seal, and no property owner signature. It listed a series of vague infractions under a generic category titled Category B Aesthetic Violations. Bob looked it over, handed it back, and said one word: "No." The man shrugged, said he'd have to report a refusal of service, and packed up the tools without complaint. Bob watched them go, quietly memorizing the license plate before returning inside to document the interaction. He didn't know who had arranged it, but he didn't need to guess. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just issuing verbal complaints anymore. She was leveraging whatever informal authority she believed she held to influence outside vendors. 2 days later, Bob received an email, not to his personal account but to the contact form listed on a small woodworking website he had barely touched in years. The message was from someone calling themselves Neighborhood Harmony Liaison, thanking him for considering voluntary compliance with our standards and inviting him to a resolution session the following week at a local community center. Bob stared at the screen, trying not to laugh. He hadn't agreed to anything, hadn't signed anything, and the fact that this nonsense had found its way to his private business page meant someone had been digging. Karen was moving from passive aggression to targeted pressure, and she was bringing bureaucracy with her. Still, Bob didn't bite. He responded only with a formal email stating that he would not attend any meeting that wasn't scheduled through his attorney and that any attempt to initiate changes on his property without consent would be treated as trespass. His lawyer, Mark Hanley, a practical, soft-spoken man who had once prosecuted land disputes for the state, advised him to remain observant and patient. "These things always feel worse than they are," Mark said, "until they suddenly aren't." Bob appreciated the honesty. Then came the tipping point. It happened on a cloudless Wednesday morning. Bob had just returned from a routine appointment at the VA clinic and was unloading groceries from the trunk using the adapted lift in the back of his car. As he moved up the driveway toward the ramp, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of his property, Karen, holding a measuring stick and what looked like a printout of his yard from Google Maps. She wasn't hiding. She stood in plain view, measuring the edge of his flower bed, as if she had jurisdiction over every inch of green in the county. Bob watched her for a moment, then called out without anger, just directness. "Karen, what are you doing?" She didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her expression wasn't guilty. It was righteous, defiant. "Verifying your setbacks," she said. "There have been complaints. The plants are encroaching the easement." "There is no easement," Bob replied. "This property line hasn't changed in 30 years. "Well," she said, tapping the stick on the ground, "maybe it's time it did." It wasn't the words that made Bob pause. It was the way she said them, like a person with nothing to lose and something to prove. Her voice didn't carry threat as much as it carried finality. the conviction of someone who had decided how things ought to be and was now rearranging the world to match. That night, the lock on Bob's gate was tampered with. Not broken, just misaligned, as if someone had tried to pick it and failed. He changed the lock the next morning and added a deadbolt. He didn't bother reporting it to the police. He knew what they would say. No sign of forced entry, no proof, no case. But he felt it. The shift. Karen wasn't just pestering him anymore. She was probing, testing the boundaries of what she could get away with, looking for the line where audacity became plausible deniability. The next day, Bob found a fresh mound of white mulch dumped on his driveway. No receipt, no delivery notice, just a pile of wet, chemically potent landscaping filler that stained the concrete and made it difficult for his wheels to grip. It took him 3 hours to shovel it away by hand, one scoop at a time, sweat mixing with quiet fury as he scraped and dumped and scraped again. No one helped. No one asked. The neighborhood watched, windows twitching, blinds shifting, but no one came out. Bob didn't mind. He didn't need the help. What he needed was distance from this war of attrition that seemed to grow more absurd by the day. He started sleeping less, not from fear, but from hypervigilance. He installed secondary locks, moved his cameras to cover blind spots, and stopped using the front door altogether. He was preparing, not reacting, and deep down, some part of him knew this wasn't going to end with fines or letters or mulch. Karen didn't want compliance, she wanted erasure, and she was almost out of patience. A few days after the mulch incident, the real signs of sabotage began to emerge. They were subtle, not the kind that would jump out at a casual observer, but Bob noticed them immediately. He knew the precise layout, texture, and rhythm of his property like a soldier knows his weapon. Near the edge of the wildflower patch, the soil looked wrong. Darker in some spots, gritty in others, and a few of the newest goldenrod shoots were already wilting, their leaves browned and curling as if burned from the inside. There hadn't been rain, and his irrigation system was as steady as ever. This was surgical damage, targeted, controlled. Someone had crept onto his land again, this time with chemical intent. Bob didn't panic. He didn't make noise. He collected soil samples with gloved hands, sealed them carefully, labeled the bags, and packed them in a cooler. No calls to the police. He didn't waste time on the slow wheels of hollow procedure. Instead, he took the samples to a retired soil scientist he'd once worked with during a community garden project. A few days later, he got the answer. The soil had been treated with diquat dibromide, a fast-acting herbicide not sold to the general public. Whoever did it had access to restricted-use chemicals. That changed the game. This wasn't someone throwing a tantrum over grass. It was a planned, resourced attempt to cause real damage. Bob's quiet strategy didn't change. He continued to log every incident, each entry documented with photo evidence, precise notes, and a tone devoid of emotion. His attorney, Mark, reviewed it all, adding comments where needed, but reminded him that as airtight as the documentation was, it wouldn't matter unless it tied to a specific person. And so Bob remained patient. He didn't retaliate. He prepared. Karen, for her part, vanished. No walks, no porch chatter, no patrols, no eye contact. Her property seemed frozen in time. Bob recognized this behavior, not retreat, but recalibration. This was the quiet of someone cooking up something new. It didn't take long. He received a letter, delivered not by mail, but by courier. A printed envelope with sharp corners, no return address, only the words Regional Compliance Advisory Board printed in bold at the top. The contents were even more absurd than the title. 6 pages accusing him of non-compliant flora expansion, pedestrian view obstruction, and unauthorized ecological deviation. The document cited codes that didn't exist anymore and included diagrams of his property pulled from satellite imagery. He scanned it, then sent it straight to Mark. The verdict came quick. None of it held legal standing. There was no such entity as the Regional Compliance Advisory Board. The listed return address turned out to be a rented mailbox in a rundown strip mall outside town. Mark dug deeper and confirmed what Bob already suspected. 2 years earlier, Karen had used that very address when she registered a short-lived lawn consulting business that failed within 6 months. This was a smear campaign, poorly disguised as due process. It wasn't lawful, it was manipulative, performative, and rooted in the assumption that most people wouldn't know the difference. Bob knew better. He responded by tightening his security. Not flashy, not aggressive, just smarter. He hired Curtis, a quiet, no-nonsense former Marine who now offered patrol services to rural properties. No uniform, no marked vehicles, no intimidation, just presence. Curtis passed through twice each night, never at the same hour. On his third visit, he spotted a hooded figure crouching near Bob's back gate with what looked like a garden trowel and a spray bottle. When he stepped forward, the person bolted, cutting around the corner into a car parked on the next block. Curtis didn't chase. He snapped a photo of the car, the plates, and the area near the gate where the soil had clearly been disturbed again. The car, it turned out, belonged to a landscaping contractor registered under a shell company. That company's address? Karen's. That was all Bob needed. Mark now had enough to begin filing for a civil protection order and initiating a claim for targeted harassment and property tampering. "We're moving forward," Mark said, "but don't let your guard down. The people who go this far, they don't stop easily." Bob didn't intend to wait. He upgraded his entry points, replacing his front door with a storm-grade model designed for wheelchair access and fortified against forced entry. Cameras were repositioned to eliminate blind spots. His routines shifted. He stopped using his front porch entirely. He spoke to no one. He didn't need to. Everything was now methodical, purposeful. He was preparing for inevitability. That inevitability came as a flyer taped to his new door. It wasn't signed, just printed in oversized, aggressive font. Emergency Neighborhood Assembly. Ongoing behavioral concerns. Attendance required. Non-participation will be noted. It was both laughable and disturbing. Bob didn't go. He knew it wasn't a meeting. It was theater. It was Karen staging a tribunal for an audience that wouldn't question her lines. He stayed on his back porch while the gathering happened. He heard the voices, some loud, some uncertain, a few half-hearted attempts at unity. They weren't speaking to him. They were speaking about him. Not that it mattered. That night, someone spray-painted the side of his shed with the words, "You don't belong here." The paint was thick, black, dripping like tar. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like the start of something worse. He reported none of it. Not yet. But he logged it, filed it, photographed every detail. A day later, a window shattered. A rock, wrapped in red ribbon, landed on the floor inside his living room. Tied to the ribbon was a slip of paper with a single sentence. "This is your last season." Bob picked it up, read it once, and placed it carefully into a fireproof case along with the rest of the evidence. There was no emotion on his face, just resolve. He no longer saw Karen outside. Her windows remained closed, curtains drawn, porch light off, but he knew she was watching. He could feel it, the kind of attention that didn't blink, didn't rest, and wasn't content with silence. She had crossed every line but one, and when that final line came, it wouldn't arrive with paper or paint. It would come like a shadow across the threshold, wordless, quick, and irreversible. And Bob would be ready. It was after the broken window, after the rock and the ribbon and the warning note, that Bob decided he couldn't play defense anymore. He hadn't been afraid, not even when the vandalism crossed the threshold of his home, but he was aware, sharply aware, that the next act might not be symbolic. Mark had begun the formal filing process for the restraining order, collecting every piece of evidence, every time-stamped photo and affidavit. But Bob knew how slow the system moved. Legal gears didn't grind faster because the threat was real. They moved when paperwork aligned, when judges had time, when hearings were scheduled, and forms were reviewed. In the meantime, he was still alone in that house, the target of a neighbor who had clearly crossed the border between obsession and danger. Bob adjusted. He didn't wait for permission or apology. He moved his workstation to the rear of the house where visibility was tight and access limited. He reinforced the shed, replaced the old bolts with commercial-grade locking systems, and installed motion-triggered floodlights around the perimeter. His routine shifted as well. Meals were quicker, movements more deliberate, no wasted energy. Even Daisy, his dog, seemed to sense the change. She stayed closer to him than usual, her body alert, ears twitching at distant noises. It wasn't fear. It was vigilance. He had known this mode before, years ago, in different terrain, under a different kind of threat. But the instincts translated. The silence from Karen's house stretched on, long and unnatural, and Bob had to remind himself that silence didn't mean retreat. She wasn't a character from a cheap play who'd been shamed into hiding. She was calculating, waiting, repositioning. The escalation had plateaued, but it hadn't broken. It was the pause before a larger step, and he could feel it building like pressure under a rusted pipe, just waiting for the right moment to rupture. The moment came when a letter arrived in his mailbox. Not one of Karen's anonymous flyers, not another mock legal threat, but a formal envelope with a county seal. It was from the zoning department. The content was brief, technical, and cold. A notification of a pending review on his property in response to multiple public complaints regarding environmental violations. The letter cited concerns about invasive plant species, inadequate ground coverage, and a vague line about unregulated pollinator activity. Bob stared at it for a full minute before setting it down. It wasn't enough to accuse him of violating aesthetics anymore. Now the accusations carried environmental weight, the kind that could involve inspections, fines, or even forced remediation. This wasn't Karen acting alone. This was Karen discovering how to weaponize systems. It wasn't difficult. Public complaint forms were anonymous, digital, and largely unverified before action was triggered. A few clicks from the right person, a few buzzwords, and someone behind a desk would do the rest. Bob forwarded the letter to Mark, who confirmed that it was real, but also that it wasn't final, just a review notice. There would be a site visit. No dates yet, just a warning. Mark was clear. Do not interfere. Document everything. Be present when they come. We'll respond if they cross any lines. Bob agreed, but his mind had already shifted to strategy. He wasn't going to be railroaded out of his home by some bureaucratic tactic cloaked in digital cowardice. He began preparing, not just cleaning, but organizing. Every tool, every tag on every plant, every irrigation schematic he'd drawn up when he retrofitted the garden was pulled and stacked. He created a binder, labeled, tabbed, cross-referenced. If they were coming to inspect, they would meet a man who knew every inch of his land like scripture. The inspection team came without knocking, a week after the letter. 2 people in vests, clipboards in hand, accompanied by a third in casual clothes who introduced himself as a community liaison. Bob greeted them from the porch, polite but firm, and immediately asked to see identification and a written summary of the complaint. They complied, surprised but not resistant. The list of complaints was vague. An anonymous report had flagged his yard as unsanitary, unsuitable for residential adjacency, and a potential cause of allergic reactions in children. Bob's eyes narrowed at that last one. He had no direct neighbors with children. He let them onto the property, accompanied them step by step, answering every question with documentation, referring them to page numbers in the binder he carried on his lap. When they gestured toward the wildflower patch, he handed them a laminated sheet confirming the species were state-approved, low allergen, and listed as beneficial to native pollinators. When they asked about the small compost tumbler near the shed, He showed them the receipt proving it was EPA certified and within residential guidelines. By the end of the visit, they had nothing. They left without issuing a single citation, and though they said nothing, Bob saw the look on their faces. They expected to find chaos, neglect, or a man who couldn't defend himself. Instead, they found order, precision, a man who knew the law better than they did and had prepared not with outrage, but with quiet, irrefutable evidence. That night, the silence from Karen's house broke, not with noise, but with light. Every exterior bulb on her property flicked on at once. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't watching. But Bob noticed. It wasn't a signal. It was a show of presence. She knew. She had heard. She'd waited for the county to do her work for her, and they failed. Now, the pressure returned to her. Bob sat by the back window, Daisy curled at his side, and watched the glow across the street. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the shift he'd been waiting for, the moment when intent collided with reality. She couldn't hide behind complaints or systems anymore. The law had looked, and the law had passed. Her illusions were cracking. But cracks in unstable people didn't lead to quiet retreats. They led to collapse. And in that moment, watching the light of her porch flood the sidewalk in unnatural brilliance, Bob understood something with perfect clarity. She wasn't finished. She had simply realized she had one move left, and when she made it, it wouldn't be through paper. It would be steel. It was no longer about grass, flowers, or what a neighborhood should look like. The moment the county inspectors left Bob's property without issuing a single violation, something shifted. Not in the air, not in the neighborhood's routine, but in Karen. She didn't show herself. She didn't march over with a clipboard or stick anything to his gate. But Bob knew. People like her didn't absorb defeat. They mutated it. She had tried bureaucracy, tried passive sabotage, tried weaponizing neighborhood sentiment. Nothing had worked. Now she would turn to something more primal. And sure enough, it began again. This time, quieter and sharper, like the edge of a needle instead of the blunt force of a hammer. 3 days after the inspection, the access ramp on Bob's east side porch jammed. It didn't collapse. It didn't crack. It simply stopped moving, its hydraulic assist frozen mid-angle. Bob, who had checked the mechanism just 2 nights earlier, rolled back inside using the rear entrance. He opened the ramp casing the next morning and found something he'd never seen before. A fine, sticky residue coating the release springs. Not dirt, not corrosion, but something viscous and unnatural. Later that day, the power to his exterior motion lights cut out. At first, he thought it was a breaker issue, but the junction box showed tampering. 2 wires clipped clean and taped back as if to disguise the sabotage. No messages, no accusations. Just little malfunctions, precise enough to affect mobility and visibility, and subtle enough that to anyone else they'd look like wear and tear. He didn't panic. He adapted. He ordered replacements, bypassed the damaged wiring with an independent power unit, and rewired the ramp control from inside, locking it with a digital override that couldn't be triggered manually. He kept moving, but the circle was tightening. That week, Mark confirmed the restraining order hearing had been scheduled, and that law enforcement had finally reviewed the full file. There would be questions. There would be statements. And if Karen showed up to contest it, the court would see everything. From the fake letters to the property damage to the surveillance footage. Bob felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. Not enough to rest. Just enough to breathe. But the lull didn't last. The next act was bolder. Bob was in his shed working on a wooden trellis design Evelyn had once sketched in the margins of a seed catalog when he heard a strange, repetitive clinking sound outside. Not near the house. Near the street. By the time he made it down the drive, staying low and silent, the sound had stopped. But something new stood in the grass between the sidewalk and the fence. A sign, staked into the earth with a steel rod, large and gleaming in the sun. It read, "Property under review for acquisition. Inquiries. Future Living Development Group." A number was printed beneath, along with a QR code. It was printed professionally, mounted clean, with no indication of who placed it. Bob didn't touch it. He photographed it, checked the ground around the post, and saw fresh footprints. 2 sets, not Karen's small steps, but heavy boots, like someone had been dropped off and picked up again. He called Mark immediately. The name of the company didn't register in any public database. It wasn't real. Another layer, another illusion. This was psychological warfare now. That night, Bob parked his chair near the front window, lights off, Daisy beside him. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just past the darkest stretch before dawn, his exterior camera caught movement near the back gate. 2 silhouettes, both hooded, approached the fence, one carrying what looked like a canister, the other a long pole. Bob activated the floodlights manually. The intruders froze for only a second before running. He hit the alarm, a sharp tone that rang across the yard and into the night. It wasn't for help. It was a message. The next morning, Bob found a patch of soil near the wildflowers singed and smoking. The pole had been used to try and push something over the fence, a chemical bomb, maybe just vinegar and salt, maybe something worse. Whatever it was had failed. Mark pressed the police for an incident report. The sheriff's office responded with interest but little urgency. No one had been caught. The footage showed figures, not faces. Bob, however, knew what came next. He had seen it play out before, in different lives, under different flags. When calculated destruction didn't work, people turned to confrontation. Not the kind that shouted from the street, the kind that came with eyes wild and logic gone. And in Karen's eyes, the mask of justification had already begun to crack. That week, Bob made one change. He stopped keeping his front gate locked, not because he was giving in, but because he needed her to come through it. She was losing ground, losing the crowd, and when control slipped from her fingers, she wouldn't go quiet. She'd go desperate. It happened on a day as unremarkable as any other. The sun was low, light golden, trees still, street silent. Bob had just finished tightening the screws on the final brace of Evelyn's trellis and was wheeling back toward the porch when he saw her. Karen, standing just outside the open gate, not saying anything. She didn't have the clipboard. No papers, just her. Arms folded. Her eyes weren't wild, not yet, but they were locked on him like a raptor's. Bob didn't move quickly. He didn't raise his voice. He said only, "You're trespassing." She stepped forward. "I'm just here to talk," she said, but her voice had a tension in it. A high wire stretched too far. Bob didn't respond. She stepped further in. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You're poisoning this place with your filth, your weeds, your presence." Bob looked at her calmly, hands on the wheels. "Leave." She reached into the oversized pocket of her jacket. Slowly, like she was trying to convince even herself that she wasn't doing what she was doing. Bob saw the shine before the shape, a flash of metal, a compact pistol, old, ugly, and real. Her hand trembled as she pulled it free, pointing it toward the ground, then shifting it halfway upward. "You won't leave," she said, her voice cracking, not from fear but from effort. "You're like mold. You grow in the corners and ruin everything." Bob didn't flinch. "You're holding a weapon." "You're the threat," she said, tears forming but not falling. "Everyone says it. They just won't say it to your face." Daisy growled once, deep and low. Karen's hand jerked. The gun fired. The sound cracked through the air like a bone snapped in half. Bob's chair jolted as the bullet tore into the frame near the wheel well, missing his leg by inches. He didn't fall, didn't scream. He stayed still, watching her face as realization overtook adrenaline. Karen looked down at her hand like she didn't recognize it. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Neighbors had heard the shot. Doors opened. Phones were lifted. Karen dropped the gun. Not in surrender, more like the weight of it suddenly exceeded her ability to hold on. She turned and ran, not toward her home, but into the street, stumbling, irrational. Bob didn't chase. He didn't shout. He simply lowered his head and closed his eyes, exhaling a breath that had been waiting to be released for weeks. The sheriff's department responded in force this time. Karen was found hiding behind a row of hedges 2 streets over. She resisted arrest, screamed about invasion, insubordination, property rot. She was restrained, cuffed, and taken away. Witnesses gave statements. Footage was reviewed. The evidence was clear. She had trespassed, pulled a gun, and fired a shot. There would be no technicality to shield her now. She had crossed the final line, and it was drawn in gunpowder. The days that followed the shooting didn't unfold with chaos or panic, but with a slow, methodical procession of official responses that felt both overdue and strangely detached. Bob gave his statement twice, once to the responding officers that night and again to the investigator the following afternoon. He recounted everything with the same clarity and precision he'd applied to the rest of the conflict. Dates, documents, patterns of behavior, and escalation. He provided video evidence, security footage, copies of anonymous letters, photographs of damaged property, and the full logbook he'd kept meticulously since Karen's first visit. The investigator, a tall, quiet man with lines around his mouth that suggested years of listening to madness in suburban packages, read through every page without interruption. When he finally closed the folder, he said only, "This should have been stopped a long time ago." Karen was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful discharge of a firearm, trespassing, and several counts of harassment related to previous incidents uncovered during the investigation. The court denied her bail after reviewing the footage and the prior warnings filed by Bob's attorney. Her lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, emotional instability, even neighborhood stress disorder. The judge wasn't interested. She was remanded for psychiatric evaluation under supervision, pending trial. News didn't spread quickly, not officially. No headlines, no dramatic coverage. But neighbors knew. People who had kept their heads down throughout the ordeal suddenly had opinions. They stopped Bob at his mailbox with hesitant sympathy, left half-hearted notes of apology taped to his fence, and muttered phrases like, "We had no idea it had gotten that bad." Bob didn't argue. He didn't need to. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected. He wasn't vindicated either. What he felt was something simpler, heavier, an exhaustion that settled in his bones like winter. It wasn't the kind of tired that sleep fixed. It was the residue of weeks spent defending something that should have never needed defending in the first place. His right to exist quietly, to tend a piece of earth in peace, to be left alone when no harm was being done. He had done everything right. He had followed the law, documented the truth, stayed measured, calm, and fair. And still, it had nearly cost him his life. He met with Mark again, this time to review not evidence but outcomes. There would be a civil suit. It was already underway. Mark had filed on Bob's behalf for damages, for costs related to home repair, surveillance installation, emotional distress, and legal expenses. The shooting had given weight to the entire case, and Karen's history of targeting other neighbors, even if they had never formally complained, was now part of the broader legal strategy. Bob didn't want money. He wanted closure. He wanted accountability. And maybe in some small way he wanted proof on record that he hadn't imagined any of it. As the weeks passed and the yard settled into its summer rhythm, Bob returned to his routine with a caution that didn't quite leave him. The hole in the side of his wheelchair frame had been patched, but he chose to keep the original wheel as a reminder. He stored it inside the shed, next to the broken gate latch and the charred remnants of the first complaint sign Karen had ever taped to his door. He wasn't sentimental, but there was something about those objects that mattered. They weren't trophies. They were proof. They were evidence of how far things could go when no one stepped in early enough. Daisy remained close. She had aged during the ordeal, her coat thinner now, her steps slower, but she never strayed far from Bob's side. At night she would lie beside the back door, ears perked, even in sleep. She too had been shaped by the tension, molded into something more alert, more protective. They moved together now, not as owner and pet, but as companions forged under siege. The trellis in the garden was finally finished. Bob installed it one morning just before the sun rose too high, anchoring it into the soil Evelyn had once turned over with her own hands. He didn't make a speech. He didn't invite anyone. He just placed it there, steady and quiet, where the wildflowers had started to bloom again despite the damage. The wood was warm in the sun, curved at the top like her sketches had shown, and for a moment, standing beside it in silence, Bob allowed himself to feel something rare. Peace. Not because the battle was over, but because he had survived it without losing who he was. The neighborhood changed after that. Not dramatically, not overnight, but subtly. The sign that had once welcomed people to Brook Pine Estates, a community of excellence, was quietly removed and replaced with a smaller one, simpler in design. The so-called Beautification Committee dissolved without announcement. The monthly newsletters stopped coming. People tended their lawns without commentary. No more flyers, no more whispered judgments, just grass and time. Bob's civil case proceeded steadily, and by the time fall crept in, the court had ruled in his favor. Karen, still under psychiatric supervision, was held liable for damages. Her property was seized as part of the settlement, though Bob declined to claim any share of it. He didn't want her house. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted silence, and that's what he got. No one moved into her house right away. For months, it stood empty, the windows like dark eyes watching the street. Eventually, a young couple bought it, unaware of its history. Bob didn't tell them. He smiled when they introduced themselves, accepted their handshake, and offered no warnings. He figured they'd figure it out. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe the house had changed too. He didn't talk about Karen anymore. Not with Mark. Not with neighbors. Not with anyone. Not because he was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left to say. She had turned herself into a cautionary tale, and he had survived being the one she chose to unravel on. And that, in the end, was enough. By the time winter settled into the neighborhood, the air felt different. Not just colder, but stiller, as if the tension that had gripped the street for so long had finally dissipated into the soil, leaving behind a quiet that wasn't fragile but earned. Bob's house stood unchanged on the outside, though those who had watched from behind curtains might say it looked stronger, like the bones of it had hardened against intrusion. Nothing new had been added, no flashy security systems, no banners of defiance, but those who knew what had happened understood that a line had been drawn here, one that would never be erased. The court proceedings had ended without spectacle. Karen's property had gone into forced sale, and the funds were allocated according to the court's judgment. Bob took only what was owed, nothing more, nothing punitive. He'd declined offers to do interviews, write letters, or give statements for any neighborhood record. Mark had asked once, gently, whether he'd consider speaking publicly about what had happened, not for vengeance, but to serve as a warning for others. Bob had thought about it for a few seconds before shaking his head. Some lessons didn't need to be shouted. They only needed to be lived through. He didn't want his name etched into the story of suburban dysfunction. He wanted to get back to his life, to his garden, to a sense of normalcy that wasn't performative but real. And real life had returned in small, deliberate ways. Daisy's walks became longer again, her steps more confident. Bob rebuilt the raised planter boxes on the south side of the yard, repainted the trim on the shed, and planted 2 new maples near the back fence where the old chemical burns had left scars. Neighbors began to wave again, not with obligation but tentative sincerity. One of them, a man in his 40s who had never spoken a word to Bob during the worst of the ordeal, crossed the street one afternoon with a bag of fresh seed packets and said, "For the wildflower patch. I heard they help the bees." Bob took them, without comment. That was enough. He didn't forget what had happened, but he stopped reliving it. The bullet hole in the old chair had been preserved, mounted on a block of wood inside the garage where he kept his tools. He didn't look at it often, but he didn't hide it either. It was part of the history now, not just his, but the neighborhood's. There were no plaques, no memorials, but if someone asked, he would tell them the truth, plainly, the way a man might describe a storm that passed through and tore off part of the roof. Not with drama, but with precision. The couple who bought Karen's house repainted it a soft blue. They cleared out the rigid hedges she'd once meticulously measured, replaced the artificial turf with fresh sod, and removed the surveillance cameras she had installed to face Bob's property. One day, the young woman who lived there knocked on Bob's door with a tray of lemon bars and said, with a smile that didn't yet know the neighborhood's history, "Just thought we'd say hi. We're new, but it already feels like home." Bob took the lemon bars and thanked her. He didn't mention the past. It wasn't her burden. Spring arrived with a gentler rhythm than the one before. The trellis Bob had installed in memory of Evelyn stood firm, now wrapped in clematis vines that she had once tried to coax from seed without success. Somehow, this time, they flourished. Bob often sat near it in the early morning, watching the way the flowers tilted toward the sun. It wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity. The land had been defended. The garden had been preserved. Not perfectly, but honestly. And that was enough. One evening, as twilight set in and the neighborhood dimmed into quiet silhouettes, Bob wheeled himself to the edge of the wildflower patch where the new maples had started to bud. He placed a small metal marker into the soil. Not a headstone, not a warning, just a simple engraved plate that read, "This land was protected. Not claimed, not conquered, just cared for." He didn't expect anyone to read it. He didn't install it for anyone else. It was for him, a final act of closure, a quiet sentence at the end of a long chapter. And then he went inside, closed the door behind him, and turned off the porch light, not because he feared who might come, but because at last there was no one left he needed to keep it on for.